Most species of animals are divided into two sexes, male and female, which frequently have strong sexual dimorphism, meaning the males and females have obvious differences in physical form. Very rarely, though, in a sexually dimorphic species, an individual will be born that isn't entirely male or female. These individuals are called Gynandromorphs, and they have some of the strangest and most impressive looking bodies. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Please like and subscribe, it helps me out a lot. Recently, there were several papers published on the discovery of new insect gynandromorphs. So I figured I would talk about this because it's not something that the average person would ever see in their life. So, gynandromorphy is a genetic disease that is caused through the failure of mitosis or cell division early on in embryo development. And basically, what happens is that the cells in the early embryo fail to divide properly, resulting into the creation of, quote unquote, male and quote unquote female cells. And usually these are atypical male and female cells. The genetics get a little messy, but both cells exist within the same organism. And it's most often seen in insects, probably because insects reproduce so quickly, and sometimes it's seen in birds. But it is very uncommon. And this is what it looks like. So this is a Papilio androgeus. I hope I'm saying that right. This is the male, and this is, the typical Papilio swallowtail butterfly. This is what the female looks like. And this is what the gynandromorph looks like. And this particular form of gynandromorphy is usually referred to as mosaic gynandromorphy or patchy gynandromorphy. And it's an uneven distribution of male and female cellular characteristics. So you can see the yellow is more of the male coloration and characteristics, and then these blue patches are more of the female color characteristics. And these are actually female cells mixed in onto these male cells. This generally results in a sterile adult. But there are other forms of gynandromorphy. This sort of patchy mosaic gynandromorphy is not the most impressive. This style of gynandromorphy tends to occur later on in the embryonic development process. If the gynandromorphy is induced very early in the embryo development process, you end up with a very different body form. And it can be sometimes divided obliquely, it can be sometimes divided transversely, so that maybe, just the bottom of the abdomen is changed. But the most impressive, in my opinion, is called bilateral gynandromorphy. And this is what it looks like. The male and female characteristics are divided right down the middle of the insect, and you end up with a male side and a female side. And it's very strange looking when you end up with extremely sexually dimorphic species. So in this butterfly, it's, right down the middle, and you can see that the males and females have different coloring. In a blue morpho, again, you can see more blue on one side versus the more muted colors on the other. But it gets really nuts when you start getting outside of the Lepidoptera. Because it's not just the coloration that this affects all aspects of the body. So when you start getting into these other creatures, these orthopteroids and the stick insects and stuff, and you divide down the middle, you can see the entirely different abdomen structures. You end up with different antennal structures. It gets really, really nuts. So it's not just that the wings are different colors or that the abdomens are different colors. It's a fundamental shift in the development of the insect on two different sides of their body. This leads us into what I wanted to talk about today, which are these papers. The first is called the bilateral gynandromorph in Tenodorus sinensis, which is this mantis. And this was found in Japan. And when you first look at this lady, gynandromorph, it doesn't look that different from a regular mantis. And you wouldn't necessarily know that you were looking at a gynandromorph if you were just glancing at this. It's not as obvious as what you see in the butterflies. But if we spread the mantis and start looking closer, you can kind of see some differences here, right? So like one antenna looks bigger than the other, looks thicker than the other. One femur and tibia is bigger than the other. And then you get some different, slightly different colorations in the wings and kind of a weird abdominal structure. This is the genitalia, and you can see that there's something strange there. And if you start looking even closer, you can see there's a different form in the thorax here. You get more bulging on this side. It's more straight on this side. So you can kind of start to see that there's something not quite right with this mantis. So then if we zoom in on the faces, this is where it gets crazy. So we'll start here on C. C is a normal female. Short antennae. It has a, what would you say, a more rhomboid shaped head. The eyes tend to be less bulgy and, what would you say, they're more elongated laterally. And then if you go over, this is a male, and you can see the male has a much more triangular head shape compared to the female. The eyes are more round, they stick out more, the antennae are much larger. Also here on the female, the ocelli, these smaller eyes, the individual lenses, tend to be smaller than the ones that you see on the male. And then we look at our Gynandromorph. The antennae, like you saw them before, one is bigger than the other. If you look at the ocelli, really zoom in here, you have 3 different sized and shaped ocelli. Very, very odd. The head shape is somewhere in between the male and female. So you actually get a more triangular shape on this side and a more, rhomboid shape on this side. You end up with one eye. If you kind of divide this down the middle, let me get rid of all these red lines so there's less to look at here. You have 2 different shaped eyes. They stick out completely differently. So you're talking about obvious bilateral differences in the structure. And this is in a more subtle species that you're still seeing this. If you go into like the genitalia, it's an absolute mess. And it's because they don't actually have functioning genitalia. This isn't like sometimes what you see with intersex species or intersex individuals where, or hermaphroditic individuals like you have with snails and stuff where they have functioning genitalia. In this case, the genitalia aren't even formed properly. So this A and D are the Gynandromorph. B and E is what the male should look like on the top and underside. And then C and F are what the female should look like. So you can see you have this sort of hodgepodge construction because there's, in most animals, the genitalia are formed symmetrically. And because you're not forming this symmetrically, you end up with things that shouldn't be connected to each other. It's very, very strange. But in some other species, or in other orders of insects, you end up with gynandromorphy, this bilateral gynandromorphy that is very severe because of sexual dimorphism and is not at all subtle. So this would be what a mayfly gynandromorph looks like. And it's kind of crazy. So in male mayflies tend to have much bigger eyes because they have to spot the females. So you have a male side and a female side, and you have one tiny little eye and one giant eye. And then you also have genitalia differences. But what they found in this case, these were mayflies collected out of China. And this paper was called A Report of Intersex Individuals from Southeastern Chinese Choroterpes facilius populations. So these are Ephemeroptera. And they found 2 different kinds of gynandromorphs in this population. One was more male and one was more female. But you can still see that you have this giant formation of a male eye and a tiny formation of a female eye. And if we zoom in here, this is what the male should look like. Like I said, they have these giant eyes, and then you have the gynandromorphs, and then you have what a female should look like. And then it's the same for their genitalia. This is what the male genitalia looks like. This is what the female genitalia should look like. And then you have the 2 gynandromorph individuals that have they don't have identical structures, even though they're both gynandromorphs of the same species. One is more favoring towards the male, one is more favoring towards the female. So this is a very strange thing that exists in nature. You may not have ever heard of this. I've only ever seen it in a wasp in person, but it's really cool and I wanted to share it with you guys. I will link to these two studies reporting these gynandromorphs in the description. They're both open access. So feel free to read them and I'll talk to you guys later.